traditional owners of the land on which we live and work.
We pay our respects to the elders past and present.
Throughout time, Brisbane, the land by the river,
has been a path of transport
for all people.
A place of connection.
A place of many tracks.
The ancestors and elders travelled this terrain long ago, following tracks
that we follow today.
We recognise their connection to this country,
the waterways and community.
As we build this path through country,
while we tunnel deep beneath our river, laying tracks for greater connection,
creating new places for the future.
we acknowledge the rich traditions and the stories of the past.
At the many places we are working
to bring this project to life.
Across Brisbane,
the Gold Coast and Greater South East Queensland.
With an open heart
in mind,
we hope to
learn from the traditions, stories, customs
and practices of Australia's First Nations people.
Together,
as we build this track
for the future.
Hi, welcome to day
we acknowledge the
of,
traditional owners of the land.
National Archaeology Week. My name's Mark Cheeseman. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Queensland, and today I'll be talking about what zooarchaeology can do for you, if you can believe it. So I suppose I should start with what is zooarchaeology? So as you can see on the slide here, the study of animal remains recovered from ancient and historical archaeological sites. So that's not incredibly surprising, given that zoo is in the name. What we've got here on the slide are two images from different studies. One's from the late 19th century, which is an illustration of some animal mummies, essentially. And the other one is a Chinese diaspora study from New South Wales, looking at some of the animal remains at that site in Kiandra. So a good place to start is probably to point out the difference between zooarchaeology and paleontology. So when I tell people that I'm interested in archaeology and that I study archaeology, generally people go, oh cool, dinosaurs, which is, you know, a fair assumption, but unfortunately it's incorrect. As you can see on the slide here, I've tried to make a terrible joke, but we're not talking about dinosaurs and people's interactions with dinosaurs. We're talking about animals and humans' interactions with animals. So just to make that clear. So by identifying which animals, as well as which body parts of the animals are present at the archaeological sites, in addition to some of the taphonomic and human modification of those remains, which I'll go into a bit later, we can look at things such as social structure, economy, diet, of course, ecology of the local area, ideology, religion, and many other things, which I probably won't go into today. So on the other side of the slide, on the right-hand side, you've got an illustration of a horse skull and some arrows underneath indicating that there are some slight modifications to that bone there. So what that's pointing out, and this is from a study that came out a few years ago, what that's pointing out is some modification to the bone made by harnessing during the Bronze Age in Mongolia. So that sort of pushes back the confirmed evidence, or at least we can call it confirmed evidence, of harnessing, I suppose, in the Bronze Age in Mongolia, to make that as clear as possible. So continuing on, what is zooarchaeology? So I'll do a brief and hopefully not very boring history of zooarchaeology, or the study of animal remains from archaeological sites, because the term zooarchaeology is fairly recent. But in terms of the history of zooarchaeology, generally the scientific study of animal remains, we could say, started in the late 19th century. Around this time, you've got publications, of course, like The Origin of Species coming out in 1859 by Charles Darwin, talking about Darwinian evolution, of course, but then there's also The Principles of Geology, which came out a little bit earlier, and that sort of is really the beginning of scientific geology. And during this period, we start to see an understanding unfolding about the sheer depth of time that people and animals, of course, have been on the planet. So on the next slide here, what you see is a lot of people not necessarily looking at the relationship between the animals and the people at the sites that they're getting these remains from, but rather you see a lot of people indicating that, hey, we have these extinct species here in association with human remains and human settlements. So presumably they're on the landscape, getting around at the same time, interacting. So that sort of goes against what you might learn from the Bible, for example. And of course, that was all happening in the 19th century. So moving on. What you also might see people investigating the environmental changes through time based on different species of animal taxa, which would be present throughout the strata of a site. And in some cases, the species would be used to define those changes. So in this slide here, on the right-hand side, well, on the left side, you can see some people excavating in the 19th century, which is pretty cool. On the right-hand side, you've got some stratigraphic layers which are indicating a change through time, but underneath you can see that they're labeled as well. We've got a mammalian layer, above that a fishbone layer, above that Echinus layer, actually not sure what that is, and above that original hardpan. So what that's indicating is changes in the species which people are preferentially gathering for food. So moving on a little bit into the early 20th century. So in terms of general archaeology, this is usually referred to as the culture historical period, which means essentially people were more interested in compiling chronologies of what happened in the past based on excavated sites. So in terms of zooarchaeology, or the scientific analysis of animal remains, generally that would be left to analyzing the animal remains which are found in association with human burials, rather than using them to understand food resources or environmental change or anything like that, although of course that did happen sometimes. More commonly you would find people analyzing and identifying the faunal remains that are found with human burials. So that's what we've got on the slide here. On the left we have some human remains, so apologies if that upsets you. This is from a site in North America. And on the right-hand side are those animal remains that are arrayed around the skull, which are canine teeth. And this is just some more remains from that site. We've got on the right-hand side of the slide, there's the upper half of a bear's maxilla, so the top jaw essentially, and then some more canine teeth. So these were all found in association with human remains. So moving on a little bit further, so when we get to the mid-20th century, say like the 1920s through to the 1940s or so, maybe the 1950s, what we have is people starting to move beyond just describing what they're finding and creating lists and chronologies based on that information. We're actually starting to see, of course this was happening earlier, but more commonly we're starting to see people consider lifeways, consider some cultural behavior associated with these remains. And of course, what goes along with that is an interest in the plants and animal remains that are associated with the archaeological sites. So throughout the 50s, at the same time, we have a series of publications by Lee Lyman, who is spending a lot of time thinking about how the methods and the techniques of not only analysis, but actually excavation and collection of these animal remains, how they can be improved, essentially. He's pointing out all of these problems, and he's trying to figure out how we can move forward and improve those techniques. So yeah, there you go. Okay, so during the 1950s, that's what was going on, as a generalization, of course. And so for any archaeologists in the audience, they will be very familiar with the guy on the screen, maybe not so much this image, although it was just found on Google. But this is, what we're talking about now is, we're just delving into a brief history of archaeological thought. So we're talking about theory, but I'm just going to try and not use that word because it might freak some people out. But what we're talking about is how people are thinking about doing the science of archaeology, how they're thinking about analyzing these things, how they're thinking about whether or not they need to be in a chronology, or if we're going to ask some questions and try and create some hypotheses and then test those hypotheses. But in terms of archaeological theory, this is called processual archaeology. And so any archaeologist in the crowd will be very familiar with that. So as opposed to the previous science that was going on in, say, the 19th century, right up until the 50s. When we get to the 1960s, we have somewhat of a revolution in archaeological thought. We're going from being descriptive to trying to explain what we're seeing in the archaeological record. So rather than just describing it and compiling lists, we're now trying to understand why these changes are taking place. So again, moving from the 50s to the 60s, we have culture processes versus culture history. So instead of just compiling those lists and understanding this is what happened here, this is what happened subsequently, we're now moving towards trying to figure out which processes were maybe driving those changes. We move from inductive understandings to deductive understandings. So I'll move on to the next slide when I talk about that a little bit. So we go from compiling lists and creating some sort of authoritative statement of what took place in the past to testing hypotheses about why these changes might have taken place, as I've already spoken about. We go to project design rather than just accumulating data, so going out to the field and digging everything that we can. Instead of doing that, we're going to put together a project, try and figure out some questions that we might want to answer, and then move out, figure out where the best place to excavate is to answer those questions, and then do that rather than just excavate the whole site. We're moving from qualitative, so again, descriptive, towards quantitative, so using lots of numbers and math. Yay, not one of my favorite things. And optimism versus pessimism. So that's a little bit vague, but might just skip that one. So rather than, as it says on the bottom here, rather than placing an emphasis on movements of people as the primary course of change, so for a long time it was considered if we see stylistic changes in pottery, for example, and food remains through the sequence, as in through time, for say 2,000 years, and then there's a big change in the remains that we're looking at. For a long time, that was explained by new people physically moving into that region and taking over that region and bringing new culture and ways of living with them. And so we're moving away from that idea to now thinking about how we can understand whether or not it was an internal process that created that change. So through time, we're getting depositions of different kinds of cultural material, not because people are moving into the area, which are different people, but those same people are just developing into different groups of people, and they're sort of seeing the world in a different way, creating different artifacts, that kind of thing. This is all obviously a massive generalization, but this is how we can briefly explain the history of archaeological science. And so along with this, we do start to see early processual archaeologists looking into more of humanity's relationship with the environment, which obviously includes looking at subsistence, which is just what people are eating, and the economy that might be developing around that, as well as other processes within the society, which, again, as I said before, might explain why these changes are taking place. And what the guy on the slide here wearing this really dashing vest is Louis Binford. So archaeologists will know a lot about him. So in terms of deduction versus induction, so just looking at the bottom of the slide, so this is what they were kicking back against, these observations, and then analyzing the observations, and then coming up with a theory and saying, oh, okay, here we now have an explanation for why these things are changing. People have just moved into the area, and there's my theory, and I'm the authority on this particular context, so take it or leave it. So what we're moving towards during this period of time is deduction, as in the idea of coming up with a theory of why this might be the case, going out and collecting data, so doing those observations and then analyzing the remains in the lab, and then from that process coming to a conclusion based on actually analyzing the data. So it's a slight change, but it's a really important change because it means we go from trying to explain things that we're seeing to taking a step back and theorizing something and then finding evidence to fit that, or maybe refute that, but I'll go on. So how did this change in archaeological thought change zooarchaeology? So one example of a processual study, I think it's quite a recent study, but it's still considered a processual way of performing archaeology, I suppose. So would be looking at optimum foraging models. So again, this is lots of maths and statistics, which are not my favorite thing, but they do provide really interesting information. I'll give them that. So what we're looking at here is a study which came out in 2007, looking at a Paleolithic site in France. And what they were trying to do, using this, constructing a theory, seeing what the evidence says, and then deciding whether or not it fits. The way that they phrased that argument is previous research suggests that climate change resulted in increases in reindeer in this particular region. So if that's the case, which it seems to be based on the climate science, we have the chance that there's an increased rate at which people will come across this reindeer, because basically there's more on the landscape, so people are going to find them easier and probably closer to wherever they happen to be living at that time. So if there's an increase in reindeer, then we have a decrease in the distance which people have to carry those reindeer. And by virtue of that, more complete carcasses of the reindeer will make it back to the base camp, essentially. This is also known as the Schlepp effect, because you're schlepping this reindeer all the way back to the site. So what they've done here is plotted through time, so going from, on the left of that diagram, C right through to O, time is moving left to right. So we've got an increase in reindeer through time, okay, so that agrees with the statement that we've already made. We have, at the same time, through time, an increase in the evenness of the skeletal elements. And what they mean by that is, instead of having various body parts, so it might sound a bit gruesome, but we're talking about food, so instead of just grabbing a leg and maybe another leg and taking that home, and then the next day grabbing half of a carcass and bringing that home, and the next day grabbing the other half of the carcass of a different animal, I suppose, bringing that home. So you're getting all of these different body parts from different animals. What this is suggesting is that the evenness is going up through time, which means that there's more complete skeletons, essentially, which seems to support the idea that they're coming across them more easily in the landscape, potentially closer. And at the same time, in the top right there, we have a decrease in FUI, which is Food Utility Index, which basically just means a decrease in the amount of, let me rephrase that. So we have an increase in the amount of bones which don't have a lot of meat, essentially. So we're getting a lot of ankle bones, we're getting a lot of hoof bones, for lack of a better term. But what that suggests is that there's more of the complete animal coming back to the camp. So what's happened here is a theory has been put forward. An increase in reindeer across the environment will mean that essentially people will come into contact with those reindeer more frequently and be able to bring the whole animal home rather than chopping it up into different pieces and bringing the pieces home. And that's what seems to be the case. So that was just a really brief example of processual archaeology and how that can be done in terms of zooarchaeological analysis. So looking at the relationship between animals and humans, here's an example of a processual study. So moving along, so during the, say, late 70s and the 80s and the 90s, there were quite a few people who were not so happy with this style of doing archaeology. One reason, I suppose, would be the fact that a lot of those processual studies would be focusing on really large changes, like the advent of agriculture, or just focusing on hunter-gatherer societies, which means that there's a large swathe of all these archaeological sites, which, using this processual form of archaeology, if I can use that phrase, using this processual form would be pretty difficult. And also, let me just stick to the list here. So what differs between processual and post-processual would be multiple approaches. So instead of just having this particular deductive style of science, which relies on following through that process and finding, forming a theory, forming a hypothesis rather, finding evidence for that, and forming a conclusion based on the observations. So what we have now is multiple approaches. So it's a bit difficult to explain really quickly, but there are different ways, sort of different lenses through which you can view an archaeological assemblage. So we might look at it in terms of gender relations. We might look at the archaeological assemblage in terms of individual human agency, so choices that individuals are making rather than big groups of people within the larger society. We can also look at it in terms of group and individual identity, so how these people are sort of performing their identity. We can look at it in terms of power relations. So we do have all these different ways that we can analyze an assemblage and build a story based on what we find. Of course, this has roots in postmodern thinking, so I'll leave that up to you to sort of decide how that makes you feel. Classic postmodern interpretation there. Also, the aim is to understand the past for the betterment of the future. So I'll get onto that a little bit later as well. And this view rejects generalizations in the sense that there is an emphasis on looking at the unique historical or prehistoric, I suppose, circumstances of each archaeological site and region, rather than generalizing and trying to find laws about why things have changed, why we went from hunter-gatherers to then agricultural. Instead of trying to find laws to sort of make a catchphrase and then that can explain why people have developed into this different kind of group, the idea would be to put all of that aside and just look at the evidence and understand it in terms of its unique historical, the events that unfolded. Okay, so moving on, emphasis on the origin, on the individual rather than whole societies. I've already sort of mentioned that. And post-processual archaeology also embraced critical perspectives. So I'll move on to that in a second as well. And so a good way to describe it is this quote that I've got down the bottom. And I should also mention that's Ian Hodder in his fancy hat. A textual record of intentional action rather than a fossil record which requires scientific modes of explanation. So I guess that kind of, that's the explanation that I would go with in terms of the major difference between processual and post-processual, is that we're looking at a record of intentional action of people rather than a fossil record which can be interrogated scientifically. Of course, you can do both, and I think that's the important thing to take home with this whole presentation is, yes, we talk about processual archaeology, and I'm trying to minimize the jargon here, but we talk about scientific archaeology and we talk about post-processual interpretive archaeology, but people are doing a range of these nowadays. So there's not really, it's not the case that we have moved on from processual. It's just that different people are finding different ways to interpret the past and analyze the archaeological sites that they're looking at. And briefly, I wanted to talk about critical theory because, as I mentioned, with post-processual archaeology, we have, I didn't even put that info on there, don't worry about it. So with critical theory, this, in terms of the way that it's used in archaeology, because this didn't develop in archaeology, archaeology kind of pinched it, like a lot of other things, critical theory aims to critique and change society by examining assumptions that society is built upon, and also challenges modern assumptions of objective fact. So what that means, what we can infer from that is that knowledge always exists within a social and historical context. And of course, this does sound like it opens the door to ancient alien theories and all these kinds of alternative archaeologies, which are all over the internet, of course. And it's not to say that you can't do your own research and look at these things, but a critical theorist would say that you can't take these interpretations at face value. You do need to examine how that knowledge was put together in each case. So that includes looking at the pyramids and saying aliens built that. So I'll just leave that there. And also I wanted to point out, all things are subject to interpretation. Whichever interpretation prevails at a given time is a function of power and not truth. I tried to find out whether or not that's actually Nietzsche. I couldn't find anywhere. It's just all these quote websites telling me that it was a Nietzsche quote, but nobody's got any evidence that that's actually Nietzsche. So if somebody can point to the book where he wrote that, that would be super helpful. Anyway, so an example of a post-processual archaeological study in terms of zooarchaeology. So with this one, we have a study from the US looking at a Chinese diaspora site. So this is what Dr. Kevin Rains was talking about yesterday with his sites. There's a long history in Australia, of course, of Chinese immigrants coming over for gold mining and other reasons. And so you can watch his presentation for a really good overview of that. This is referring to the same phenomenon. Chinese diaspora, we're looking at people in the US, New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, different places in Southeast Asia. But for this particular study, this is a good example of an archaeological study really taking on board that critical theory approach. So at the bottom of the screen here, we've got a quote from the study. From the author's perspective, stories of discriminatory legislation are not complete unless they also include discussions of how legislation historically structured action and agency within and between targeted populations, and the archaeological telling of the story of Mono Mills, which is the name of the site, probably should have mentioned that, aims to do just that. So what they're saying is we need to look at these things from a historical and archaeological perspective, not just talk about their effects today. We need to look at the trajectory through time of how these things develop. How we end up in a society where these things are happening is not we just wake up and they're happening. There is a long historical course of events which took place, series of events maybe I should say. But in terms of the zoo archaeology, for this study it was really interesting because they were finding this is a multi-ethnic settlement. There are Europeans living there, there are Chinese people living there, there are Native Americans living there, sort of around outside the main settlement. But what they found in different areas across the site was evidence of Chinese material culture in Native American settlements and evidence of Native American material culture, as in foodways and things like that, in the Chinese settlement area as well. So there's obviously some kind of relationship has formed between those groups. So that's really interesting. And the main way that they were identifying these relationships was by looking at the food remains. So I think that's really interesting. So now we've done the history of zoo archaeology, really blasted through it. You know, that was a massive generalization, all of these things that I've spoken about, but gives you a good idea of where we, sort of how we've gotten to the point at which, you know, how we've gotten to where we are. And I've included a really bad joke with this bird with the three faces on there, but this is the three faces of modern zoo archaeology. So generally, you could split it into three research focus areas. So you've got methodological research, which I'll talk about, which essentially is how do we improve the research that we're currently doing. On the other side, we've got anthropological research, which is like the previous study that we just looked at, understanding human behavior. And on the third one down here would be biological research. So understanding how the animals have changed due to human interference, domestication, all that kind of thing. So this is a horrible slide, but I really wanted to include this diagram because taphonomy is a weird topic to understand when you're just introduced to it. So in terms of methodological research, which again is how can we improve our research? One of the ways that we can do that is by doing taphonomic studies. So the study of taphonomy is understanding all of the chemical and all of the natural and human processes which have affected the archaeological site and the archaeological remains between the period of somebody throwing something away into a mid and into a trash pile, and then, say 500 years later, an archaeologist carefully extracting all of those remains. So lots of things happen during that time. There might be a flood, so things might move around. There might be just some rain erosion, so things will get pulled out of the ground due to the erosion. If that happens, then the remains might roll down the hill, all of that kind of stuff. But there's also chemical weathering, so they might be sitting in really acidic soil, for example. There's also different ways that we can identify how in terms of zoo archaeology, how the remains have been modified by people. But what I wanted to point out on this slide is the middle section. So if you look at where the arrow is pointing right to the side at the top, on the right-hand side, we've got the Grim Reaper and all of these animal remains just sort of funneling into this fluvial transport system. So what this is trying to represent is essentially flooding or erosion damage, and how, maybe I shouldn't have used this. I really like this. But basically, it's a really complicated system of things potentially moving around the site. So they might be rounded on the edges, which would indicate that it's been rolled around down a hillside, that kind of thing, down a river. So this is why we've got sediment and secondary storage and water going through this ridiculous system here. But the section in the middle are the taphonomic processes. So these are the things that change the object from when somebody's thrown it away to when an archaeologist locates that object. And then, of course, down the bottom, we've either got, on the left-hand side, we've got destruction, so it's just never found, it just gets ground into dust, or on the other side is permanent burial. And of course, it can sort of then travel through that whole system again. It might be permanently buried, and then the side of a riverbank will erode and expose it again, and it'll go further down the river. But in terms of like a very simple way of explaining taphonomy and fluvial transport, that's what this diagram is trying to do. And I just wanted to point out, whoever illustrated it, no idea who it was, but obviously it's in that publication. Why did they draw the cow's face like that when he can see what's happening to... Anyway, so in terms of methodological research, so we're talking about taphonomy still. This is a book I found recently, thanks Lauren, The Atlas of Taphonomic Identifications. So this has lots and lots of photos and diagrams helping us identify different modifications that either people or nature has made to the remains that we're looking at. So on the top right, you can see a diagram which is an illustration of, I suppose, a really, really high magnification view of a cut mark made by a stone tool on bone. And so underneath that, we can see an example of a modern, an experimental cut mark made on bone. So that diagram is just helping researchers like myself understand the direction of movement, whether or not it is made by a stone tool or a metal artifact or something else, whether it's trampling. So there are lots of different ways that you can, that bones can be damaged, essentially. So we're trying to figure out whether or not it was a person that damaged the bone or if it was nature. And on the other side of the slide, we have an image of boiled bone. So that's what the surface looks like when it's highly, highly magnified. And you can see that there is a distinct difference between that image and the image below, which is digested bone. So it's been sitting in some animals or a person's stomach for a while being digested. So anyway, so this is the kinds of, these are the kinds of studies that methodological researchers will do. This is what they'll be looking at, although taphonomy is just one example of this. So moving on, we've got anthropological research. So why do people do what they do? I suppose that's one way of putting it. So in this particular study, this is a historical study from Australia, looking at a series of urban sites in New South Wales and then one rural site. So this is a food waste study looking at what people were eating and how that may or may not be a reflection of their lifestyle, of their life ways. So you can see the chart on the middle of the slide at the bottom is quite different to, sorry, the chart in the middle is quite different to the ones above and below. So what we can see there is the rural site has basically a widening of there's a larger amount of species that they're consuming. So they're doing some local hunting, they're buying larger amounts of different kinds of species, and of course eating those animals. And the urban and then the urban-rural at the top and the bottom, they actually have a narrower range of species which they're consuming. And then on the right hand of the side is a diagram of where all the cut marks are, where these animals, how these animals have been butchered, some of which was for shipping, so actually physically barreling up these animals and moving them to different locations, some of which, as in the ones down the bottom there, Old Marulan, they were probably just locally butchered. So the main point of this kind of, well, not this kind of research, but this particular study, is that they were trying to illustrate that people living in different regions and sort of different distances from the main food resource, which in this case would be in just a larger city, will have different lifestyles just based purely on the fact that they live further away from the main source of food. So you can see this here, that the case study suggests that meat choices, while governed by dietary preference, so what people actually would like to eat, were also influenced by the geographical setting. And this has a visible impact in the archaeological record. And so the last of the three phases would be biological research. So this is looking at how the animals themselves have changed through time due to human invention. It's maybe a nicer way to put it. So with this one, we're looking at a geometric morphometric study, so lots more maths, which I'm not a huge fan of, as I said earlier. But this one's really interesting. They've been able to take all of these measurements across the different areas on different species of domestic pig, but also some wild boars as well, and identify that there is a measurable difference. So if we find a fragment of a particular part of the skull at an archaeological site, and we have those landmarks which are pointed out on the skull visible to us, we can measure those landmarks, plot it in a chart against all of the other fragments that we have, and try and determine whether or not we're dealing with a wild species or a domestic species. So that has all kinds of implications in terms of trade and economics, but we'll skip through that for the moment. And so very quickly, well, not very quickly, for the rest of the presentation, so you're stuck with me now, we'll be talking about the archaeology of food. And the reason is it's very important. Food is very important. Why is food important? As omnivores, there are many potential tasty morsels across the planet. Basically, there are lots of things that we can eat, and we do eat a lot of them. Because we have big brains and strong bodies, essentially, we've figured out ways of growing those animals and plants ourselves rather than having to go out and hunt them, although that still takes place. But because we have big brains, big bodies, we can now grow, cook, combine ingredients, which means we've gone from having many potential tasty morsels to many, many more, because we can combine all of those together and process them in different ways to produce different ingredients. So what we end up with is a large amount of options, which are then constrained by local ecology. So the plants and animals that live in your local area or are available from shops in your local area nowadays, which is a little bit different. Available technology, so whether or not you have Stone Age farming implements, like Neolithic farming implements, or Bronze or Iron Age farming implements, means you have, there's a big difference in terms of output. So of course that will then constrain or widen your food choice or the available food options. Further constraints would be community traditions, but also politics, religious faith, ethnic heritage, aspirations and ambitions. So think about the different kinds of foods which are, for political or for religious reasons, frowned upon when consumed across different societies. So when people make a choice about the kind of food that they're eating and preparing and growing and harvesting, they are participating in an ongoing historical tradition. And that will either, if they're continuing that, then they'll be reinforcing that tradition. If they're deviating from that tradition, then they will be challenging the existing traditions. So this is why when we talk about foodways having identity having an influence on foodways, this is the kind of thing we're talking about. Because not only are we geographically constrained by the different kinds of foods that we might like to eat, in terms of, I grew up in this area and this is what was available, so I've developed a taste for it. Politically, religiously, if there are even gender differences in the kinds of foods that people will consume. Think about, this sort of, I won't even go there. But okay, so, and another reason why food's really important is that it's a daily repeated act. So in terms of archaeology, it means that every time somebody eats, or a family eats, or a settlement eats, they throw away waste. So the archaeological record, which is what we're excavating, that's what we're looking at, that's what's in the lab, is the archaeological record. These bits and pieces of broken pottery and bone and all this kind of stuff. That is every day. There's people throwing waste into this, which is, and the characteristics of the waste are determined by which society they're from, their historical traditions, maybe their political beliefs and their religious beliefs. So food is very important for archaeologists. And even today, of course. So looking at these articles, one from 2016, which talks about, well, both of them talk about social media and food. So posting pictures of dinners means that people have, they're able to perform self-expression in the same way that the clothes people wear, the cars they drive, and the music they listen to. Food is today's hottest social currency. Classic. The evolution of, okay, so the 2021. So the important part here is that the second part of the phrase, it also is a way to differentiate their brand from other food accounts that are out there. So this is the kind of thing when I'm talking about people performing identity. In a strange way, you can kind of draw a line between what people are doing and what restaurants are doing as well, with differentiating their brand. They're sort of drawing a line. This is what we do here. This is our identity, as opposed to the other identity of the other accounts that you might follow. So this is still very relevant in terms of how we interact with food. And so why is the archaeology of food important? So moving on from why food is important to why archaeology of food is important. So I'll try not to dwell too much on this, but sorry, it's what I'm interested in. Food is a principal medium for social interaction, for human comfort and reassurance, for anxieties and fear. It is at the heart of ideological construction or identity construction. So, and then what I should point out as well is this book, as opposed to the rest that will follow, this is an archaeobotanical publication. So this whole book is about the archaeology of food, but from a plant perspective rather than an animal perspective. So that's also a really important point that I should have made earlier, is that of course zooarchaeology isn't the only way that you can look at food. You can look at ceramics, you can look at art murals, of course, you can look at plants. So going on with the quote, traditionally archaeologists have theorized about food in terms of its use to stave off hunger, so the direct biological need for food. But social anthropologists and sociologists, they consider health, consumption, social practice, personhood creation, and including the desire and valuation of food and its contexts and meanings. So there's a lot of jargon in there, but basically we're going back to that identity creation thing. I eat this stuff because my family eats this stuff and it makes me feel good. Maybe that's an oversimplification, but there's not much time left. So why is the archaeology of food really important? So from a conservation perspective, we can look at a publication which came out a few years ago on the left of the screen there, the Lancet Commission. Food systems have the potential to nurture human health and support environmental sustainability. However, they're currently threatening both. Global food production is the largest pressure caused by humans on Earth, threatening local ecosystems and the stability of the Earth system. So for a really fun read, you can read Diet for a Large Planet. I actually recommend it. It's really good, but fun is maybe not the way to describe it. So moving on, why is the archaeology of food important? So these two publications are not specifically zooarch. They are just all of the different ways, explaining all of the different ways that you can look at food and sort of giving a lot of different examples about how you can look at food through animal remains or plant remains, art, etc. So archaeology allows us to examine foodways through time and across space in a way that no other discipline can. How do we eat? How do we farm? What happens if we farm this way as opposed to that way? History, in terms of the study of historical texts, only gives us partial answers to these questions. And the modern world gives us less insight because we're totally ignoring the historical contingency of why we've ended up this way. If we want to comprehend the range of ways in which we humans can eat, as well as the consequences of choosing certain options, which is probably the most important part, then we have no choice. We must look to archaeology. That's a really strong phrase. You'll probably never hear archaeology, really drummed into you as much as that phrase will. And this is the last one I want to mention. So this is actually not zooarch. This is just a history text, history publication, but it's really good as well. So this person, Jeffrey Pilcher, mentions that twice in human history, the human race has fundamentally transformed its source of sustenance and hence its place in the world. And no, it's not through alien intervention, it's because of food. So hopefully somebody will spread this around because I really like, just putting that on there, food. So he's talking about the change from being a hunter-gatherer society to the development of agriculture and farming about 12,000 years ago. Major oversimplification. I'm sure there's lots of people who would argue with me about the time frame of that, but let's just say hunter-gatherers to farming. On the other hand, the second event that he's talking about is the development of industrial agriculture and industrial food systems. So due to us making this change, it has totally changed the way that we interact with the planet. It's upscaled all of the ways that we used to interact with the planet. Now they've all been upscaled massively. So again, this is why the archaeology of food is important. And now for the big reveal of what zooarchaeology, I should say, can do for you. So not surprisingly, it can help us understand the past. There you go. So what I wanted to include here is, of course, some data from my work, which is looking at some of the assemblages from the Crossover Rail Albert Street precinct site, but I'm not quite there yet. I haven't looked at all the bones. There's lots and lots of bones. It's going to take me quite a while. But I thought I'd just put in my research question, which is how did food consumption choices create and reinforce group identity in both the European and the Chinese contexts in 19th century Brisbane? And then, of course, big old red arrow pointing out where in Brisbane we're talking about. So that's what I'm looking at. The remains that have come out of the Albert Street precinct hopefully will be able to tell me about not only what the people were eating in Brisbane at these two locations in the 19th century, but hopefully it will also be able to give us some information about the ideology and the politics of these people, as well as there might even be some gender differences if we can figure out where some of the who was living in some of the locations. If I can track down some names, might be a bit more interesting. But what I wanted to point out was all of these methods that I've spoken about so far, these are all available to use on an archaeological site like Albert Street. So hopefully it will be something very interesting, but I don't have any answers yet. And part two, what can zooarchaeology do for you? So we can also address contemporary problems and inform future decisions. So just make sure I'm not going over time. So there's a lot of course, when we're talking about archaeology and zooarchaeology, we're talking about things that happened in the past and how we interpret those and the science behind that. But what we can also use, is use this information that comes out of these studies the same way that we might use ecological studies to understand and improve our conservation of the environment. We can use archaeological studies to understand ourselves and improve our interactions with the world. For example, this guy here, and I've forgotten his name, that's terrible, but there's links there. So he's using his research to influence modern foodways and encouraging sustainable food practices. So he's got plenty of information on YouTube, and he's got publications, lots and lots of really interesting videos about the kinds of meals that he makes his family, some of which are pretty gruesome, but presumably pretty nutritious. And the second part of part two, what can zooarchaeology do for you? So yes, we can address contemporary problems and inform future decisions. What I should have mentioned is we're talking about food practices here. Moving on, we can say that archaeological research into contemporary urban waste has important implications for business and public health. So I was really happy with finding this, or maybe sad, maybe both. Beef and sugar wastage skyrocketed during highly publicized shortages of these foods. Panic buying in bulk led to 3 times as much food being thrown away. So during the early 70s, when this research was first taking place in New York, there was a shortage of beef, and then I think a year or two later, there was a shortage of sugar, and they were still doing the research. At that point in time, they noticed there was a lot of rotten beef being thrown away while they were there. So there was all these people panic buying beef because it was expensive and apparently going to run out. And then they weren't able to store it properly and they had to throw it out. So the fact that they panic bought all of this stuff, too much obviously, more than their family needed, they eventually had to throw out. It ended up in landfill. And the second part of this, I'll come back to that. The second part of this is that this also has important ecological implications, because the landfills that they were looking at when they excavated down 20 or 30 meters, they were finding things like sliced avocado, not this is just an image from Google, sliced avocado that was still green and it had been disposed of about 25 years earlier. So the organic waste, the food waste in the landfills was not degrading for decades. It was sitting there for decades. And so I also thought I'd point out that this was in the news last night. Argentina bans beef exports. So if you need to panic buy, stop when you've got enough for your family, please, because you'll end up throwing it away and then it'll sit in landfill for 30 years and not degrade. This is the science anyway. And the last thing that I wanted to say was, what can archaeology do for you? And the slide's a little bit smushed. I apologize for that. And I wanted to sort of move beyond lots and lots of, bombarding you with scientific analyses to just provide some quotes and just sort of reflect on those really quickly. So what archaeologists do, aside from all of the things that I've just mentioned, is we create stories by looking at the remains of past societies, past settlements, past camps, past rock shelters. We create stories based on the information that we gather from collecting and looking at and analyzing the evidence. But the important thing is that we create stories. And these stories, at least according to Robert Jordan, which is one of my favorite authors, have power. Now, he's not talking about archaeology, he's talking about stories in general. And of course, when you think about propaganda campaigns and spin campaigns, of course, stories have real power. They stir passion, they change the way people see the world. But in a slightly less romantic and more academically jargon way, we can also say that archaeology can and should serve as a basis for systematically reassessing current myths about the past and the contemporary social conditions that give rise to these myths. So this goes back to the critical theory that I was talking about earlier, where we can use, say, well, I won't give examples, but we can use archaeological evidence and archaeological sites and archaeological interpretations to provide a less biased and more humane, more critical, more accurate is a problematic word, but a more informed understanding of how we've ended up where we are, basically. And I don't know if I can say anything more than that, except for the stories are probably the most important part. The stories are what people remember. So these are the acknowledgements that I like to make. Thank you to a lot of people at all of these different institutions. Thanks to, of course, Crossover Rail for giving this opportunity. And thanks to the crew here for doing this. And thanks for sticking around.